All right, good morning, everybody. I am thrilled and honored to have you here today, especially so bright and early. Hopefully you've got those coffees ready to go. Today, I'm gonna present a case study about how we at New Relic rolled out a self-service threat modeling program, how we incorporated threat modeling into our security culture and our software development lifecycle, and how we have engineers now identifying and addressing threats. As always, clicker, there are disclaimers. Your mileage may vary, and you should always make sure to build a program that suits your company's needs and risk profile. Before we get started, a little bit about me, since that'll help show and highlight the case study. My name's Jamie Dicken, and when I started my career, I was a software developer. I eventually then led multiple software engineering teams. At this point in my career, I had very little security training. I actually thought security teams were a nuisance sometimes. You know, there were times where I often wondered if our security team even cared about having a company or a product left to protect with how much they seemed to get in the way. I say that not to shame us as security professionals, but it's this experience that has helped me bridge the gap between security teams and software engineering orgs and get them to come together to create functional processes that meet the outcomes that we all want, those resilient, secure, and amazing products. Today, I'm the Director of Security Assurance at New Relic. My teams help our over 100 engineering teams, whether they are front-end engineers, high-capacity computing engineers, data engineers, or cloud infrastructure or network engineers. And we help them design, develop, and deploy secure solutions. By our own internal counting, we have about 800 and 900 services that power our all-in-one observability product. And over the course of the last year, we successfully rolled out threat modeling to all of those. In addition to my work at New Relic, I'm also a threat modeling instructor at Showstack & Associates. There, I have the opportunity to talk to companies across the world. And this question of how do we enable software engineers to do threat modeling work and how do we scale threat modeling comes up in every class that we have, and even in our Slack community. And I know this is a common challenge, and my guess is that if you're here in this room with me today or watching the recording later, you want to know how to do it too. By the end of this talk, my goal is to give you the confidence and framework to be able to do the same. When I first started at New Relic, we had a relatively simple process for deploying new features to production. First, our engineers built stuff. They figured out the requirements, they decomposed those, they wrote the code, they tested the code. After that is when they would engage us and our security, legal, and compliance teams to do reviews. So we would have engineers ramp up and learn all that they could. This learning curve was pretty steep because, remember, 800 to 900 services and a team of 3 security engineers, that just makes it challenging. Once they ramped up, they did a whole bunch of security validation work. If everything went well, then we gave the green light to ship. I know it's early. I promise this will be the only time I ask anybody to raise their hands at this point in the presentation, but I'm curious to see who works at a company that has a relatively similar process to this. Yeah, so quite a few. So for those of you who do, you know that there are challenges with this approach already. So first, if we found something, especially if it was a fundamental design issue, nobody was happy. We were the bad news bearers coming in way too late. Philosophically, this was also a challenge because our software engineers weren't considering security during the design and the build out of their features. It was our security, legal, and compliance teams after everything had already been built. But finally, the math just didn't math to make this work very well. With over 100 engineering teams and 3 security engineers to do these security reviews, that alone meant slowdowns. And you saw on that last slide, it was a monolith. Each security review was a monolith in itself, not only with that ramp-up time, but the whole laundry list of things that happened. Predictably, we faced bottlenecks, and we knew that we had to make fundamental changes. Now, for a while, we floated this concept of a 2-part security review. We would engage earlier in the process to do a threat model and a design review, and then later on we would re-engage and do the pen test and the code scanning, the config validation, and all of that work. It didn't take us long to realize that this wasn't going to be enough. If this represents the current work going through the funnel, basic math tells us that if we cut those security reviews in half, but we do twice as many of them, it's still the same amount of work going through the pipe. This wasn't going to solve our scaling challenge. What we needed was a different approach, one that, yes, it did consider secure design and threat modeling earlier in the process, but one that also put more accountability on our software engineers and helped them be security stewards for their services. At this point in time, we had to figure out then, given all of these constraints, how do we do AppSec as a company? Now, fortunately, at the same time where we were grappling with this concept, Dino Daizovi presented at LocoMocoSec, and he introduced this concept that he called the secure developer experience, meant to be the antithesis of the standard secure development lifecycle. Now, if you think about it, user experience is not a new trend. Developer experience isn't a new trend. Those are jobs that companies employ people to do. However, we as in-house security people, we don't often think about other people's experience doing security, and that has to change. Let me illustrate. When my son was 4 months old, some friends of ours invited us to go on a boat with them. We did what any good parents would do. We researched the top-of-the-line, Coast Guard approved, highest rated, all the bells and whistles life jacket that money could buy. Look at him, though. I mean, he was safe, don't get me wrong. That kid was not going anywhere. But he was uncomfortable, he couldn't move, and he fussed the entire time. He did not enjoy that boat ride, and I guarantee you, because of that, my husband and I did not either. We hated it so much, it took us 5 more years to be willing to brave getting on a boat with children again. To be clear, not saying that I should have skipped the life jacket. That would have been irresponsible. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this is often how teams feel when they engage with security. We throw so many tools and processes and requirements onto them that they feel so constricted. Sometimes we make the process so uncomfortable and unpleasant that teams don't willingly want to do it again. Sure, in the moment, we might have had a short-term win, but long-term, we are no better off, and we might have actually just shot ourselves in the foot. So not too long after we had this aha moment, we started to roll out an internal campaign, first to the security team. And we started talking about what it meant to provide a secure developer experience and how that meant that we had to continuously put ourselves in the minds of the engineers who engage with us on a regular basis. After that, we launched a more broad campaign across the company. Our message to our engineering teams was that, yes, you own the security of your services and applications, just like you own quality and reliability and the user experience, but we are here to help you do it and to do it well. That was the cultural foundation that we needed so that we could build a self-service threat modeling program. Our goal was to help make sure that we could get software engineers thinking about security earlier in the process. And we theorized that not only would this help us deliver a better engagement experience because we could reduce the size of our security reviews and increase our velocity, but that this would actually result in more threats being identified and addressed versus our current situation where a lot of times we were coming in too late that it would be disruptive to do anything in time for that launch. Now I want to walk through the steps that we took to build that program. The first thing that we had to do was talk to our software engineering teams. We knew that they were going to give us feedback that would help us build the program that we needed, and it would inform our communications and our rollout. We also wanted to know if there were going to be any blockers. We wanted to get those out ahead of time so that we could address them. During the course of this, my teams interviewed about 12 different teams. What we learned was great. It turns out that most of our software engineers had no problem with the idea of threat modeling their own software. They were a little concerned, though. They were concerned that they weren't going to do a good enough job and that this would add a lot of friction and overhead to their processes. However, my team, when we heard this, thought that this was great news because those were solvable problems. We knew that for us to be successful, we needed to build really great training, We needed to pack in a lot of encouragement, and we had to pay particular attention to that perceived overhead so that we didn't cause enough friction that engineers didn't want to do it in the first place. At this point, hearing all of these solvable problems, we asked our teams, if we address your concerns, would you be willing to try threat modeling? And their yes, and it was cautious, I'll give you that, but that was the commitment that we needed to forge ahead, and we knew that we had the confidence to be able to go forward. It wasn't just our software engineers who had preconceived notions, though. Our security team had them too. And to be honest, these were things that didn't surprise us, and we felt them too. However, after we had done so many security reviews, we came up with a few talking points. First, we believed that our software engineers were the perfect people to start threat modeling their systems. They knew them better than we could keep up, because with 800 and 900 services, plus your front-end systems and all of that, versus the 3 engineers that I had, we faced that learning curve every time. Second, and I say this one all the time, but some threat modeling is better than no threat modeling. That was a trade-off we sometimes had to make when we had seemingly lower risk features and we had bottlenecks. Third was that we hypothesized that if developers were the ones who did the threat modeling of their systems and they did it early enough, they could either change some of their design decisions or they could bake in time to address threats as part of their projects. Again, we were already in the situation where security reviews were happening too late, that often we had to implement threat adjustments a lot later and do it retroactively after launch. And then finally, with most things, we knew we had to take a crawl, walk, run approach. Threat modeling was an organizational muscle that we had to build. No, engineers were not going to be perfect at it the first time they tried it. I don't know about you, I don't know anything that I've tried on the first time right after learning it where I've been perfect at it either, and threat modeling is the same way. So we knew that our software engineers were never going to get better if they never started trying in the first place. So getting them to start trying was the primary goal that we set out to achieve. After we laid out all of this, we asked our security teams the same thing. If we try this out and we pilot it and we review the results before we launch globally, will you be willing to support us? And we got their yes too. So at this point, we knew we were doing this thing. So things got real and we had to start making decisions. The first decision that we had to make was based on format. So we had a lot of options and a lot of strong opinions about the format. We had some folks say that they absolutely needed live training or they were never going to absorb the content. We also had people equally adamant that they wanted self-paced training, that they didn't have to worry about calendar conflicts, and they wanted to be able to return to it. We did end up going for a combination of self-paced learning in our learning management system, but we coupled that with async support for people who needed to talk to a human as well. We also decided to go the custom route with our training. We did this because we knew we could better align it to the New Relic DevSecOps philosophy of the secure developer experience. We knew that we could mature and evolve it over time and that we could provide New Relic-specific examples and workflows. Now, if that's not in the cards for you and you're looking to do something similar, Showstack and Associates does have a training, but another really good one, so Segment open sourced their training a while back, and I think their leader actually spoke yesterday and facilitated Birds of Feather. Thank you for nodding, that actually confirms that, I appreciate it. After that, we had to start thinking about how specific we wanted to be with telling engineers how they should threat model. Now, I will say this, I am generally not a fan of telling software engineers specifically how to do their jobs. I didn't appreciate that when I was a software engineer, and I didn't want to perpetuate that. However, based on the feedback in those early interviews, we learned that teams really wanted to understand and learn the mechanics of threat modeling, and so we wanted to give them enough guidance where they could apply what they've learned, but not just keep it so vague as to do threat modeling and then make that confusing and frustrating. We ended up opting for a combination of the Showstack 4-question frame of what are we working on, what could go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and did we do a good job? And we coupled that with Stride. In my experience in teaching threat modeling and working with our engineers at New Relic, it's this combination that just consistently seems to have the least amount of learning curve. It seems to be the most intuitive, and it gets people identifying threats and figuring out what to do the fastest. Now, say a team came to us and they already had previous experience threat modeling, and maybe they used the kill chain. Nobody at New Relic would stop them from doing that. At New Relic, we believe in this concept of providing golden paths to our engineers. These easy button options where they can just do them and leverage them, and it's similar to the Netflix paved roads concept. But we allow for flexibility as long as teams ensure that they're meeting the same security outcomes that we're looking for. With threat modeling, we saw no need to do anything differently. Next, we expected that our highly technical software engineering org was going to ask about tooling assistance. And so we did conduct a tooling evaluation, largely looking in the free and the open source space, because that was my budget. At the time, we came to the conclusion that at this point, we wanted to teach engineers how to do threat modeling. We didn't want to have to incur the additional learning curve of also learning how to use a new tool. We also didn't want threat modeling to be the forcing function that made our engineers switch which diagramming tool they were using when they were already creating and maintaining diagrams somewhere else. There was also one threat modeling solution that it came prepackaged with a demo application to be able to show off the features of the tool. Just for that demo application alone, it spit out an 80-page report. Now, I'm a security person and I didn't want to read that 80-page report. So it was going to be things like these that made threat modeling seem like this really big, cumbersome process. And we didn't want people to be afraid to try threat modeling in the first place because of the friction. So for now, we're going low tech. And then finally, we had to figure out when we wanted to advise teams when to threat model. And that takes me to my next step, which is that we mapped out what the software development process at New Relic looked like. I will say this, we as security people, we often think that we understand how software development works because a lot of us, myself included, I'm the worst offender, have lived that life before. But software development at every company is different. I worked at a company that at one point, this was when I was a software engineer, our security organization came to us and said, you have to do threat modeling to pass the architecture project review gate. Here was the problem. I worked for a company that did purely agile software development. We didn't have these waterfall gates. So this architecture project review gate didn't exist. What that meant was not only was that advice not helpful and not transferable for a while, it really just meant that threat modeling didn't get done for a long time. The moral of the story is don't assume that you know what your company's software development process looks like. At New Relic, we were fortunate that our security architects had laid a foundation for us already. Even though teams had differences in their operations, some followed Scrum, some did Kanban, some did Waterfall, they set out a few high-level requirements that every team had to follow to ship new software. One of those steps was that they had to create a change design document for any new feature or product iteration. You can think of this change design document as a forcing function to make sure that there's intentional architecture and intentional design. This is what we determined to be our optimal place to insert threat modeling, and we thought this for a few reasons. One was that this is where design was already happening, and since we wanted teams to threat model during design, this made sense. But also, by doing it at this stage, we could reduce the scope of what they had to threat model. These were very small, incremental features. We wanted, again, to build that threat modeling muscle and get teams to be willing to try it on a much smaller scope than telling them to threat model something this big and then they get frustrated and then they're the baby in the life jacket who don't want to do it again. At this point, we had even recommended that we insert threat modeling into the template that teams use for change design documents. I will say we did face resistance at first. In fairness, our threat modeling initiative was still in ideation. We weren't guaranteed to be successful, and this was a security ask that seemed to come out of nowhere. Here, I'm going to drop my biggest pro tip for launching a program like self-service threat modeling. And that is that if you find that you have roadblocks or challenges or hiccups, if at all possible, push those to the side, revisit those decisions later. It wasn't hard for us to say, you know what, that's fine. We're going to make a standalone template and we will revisit this decision later after we have the data to show that it's successful. So since we weren't going to use their template, we had to make our own. And the point, again, wasn't to limit teams and force them into a specific template, but to give them a golden path. Because what we didn't want to do, we didn't want teams to be so focused on the presentation of that data. We wanted them to focus instead on trying threat modeling, identifying threats, and proposing mitigations. All right, that was 6 steps, and that already was a lot of work. But at this point, we were ready to pilot with our engineering organization. So we were fortunate that we had 8 teams voluntarily go through our pilot. In our pilot, we asked them to do a few things. We asked them to take our training, apply what they learned by threat modeling something that they were already working on, and then provide us with feedback. All throughout this, we provided concierge-level support. Yes, we had our asynchronous Slack channel that we maintained, but we were also volunteering to go to teams' meetings and answer questions with them live. The reason was that it was the experience of these pilot teams where we were going to get the most amount of feedback so that we could fine-tune our rollout, and these could be our champions when we wanted to roll this out more broadly because they could share their experience and help train their peers. Throughout all of this, at the end, the feedback was phenomenal. So on the bright side, people said they really did like the training. They felt that it did help them threat model and that they were excited to go threat model something else. That was awesome. And the fact that they had applied what they learned by threat modeling something that they were currently on started to validate our hypothesis that teams would take accountability for their security and they would start to think about threats in advance and with enough lead time to be able to do something about them. Even our holdouts who insisted that they needed the live training said that the format was effective and they appreciated the async Slack support because it gave them that talk to a human capability. Now, the feedback also showed that we had some work to do before we rolled this out broadly. First, teams asked for better resources. So what we did was we started to create one-pagers and at-a-glance guides. Teams didn't want to have to refresh themselves by either Googling or going back into the learning management system to refresh themselves on what the letters of STRIDE stood for or what types of controls they could apply. We also ended up getting some threat modeling books added to our company Overdrive account so that teams could read and get more depth on their own. And to our surprise, teams actually did start checking them out. They were excited to do that. We also heard feedback that they didn't like the standalone threat modeling template. They wanted that all baked into the change design document. And so as you'll recall, that's exactly what we wanted in the first place. But that pro tip works because since we delayed that decision, now we had a successful pilot, now we had data, and now we had engineers asking for this change and not just security. It took nothing at all to make this change. And so if you're wondering if that pro tip works and you're concerned that if you delay a decision and revisit it until later, later will come. So the reason why we piloted, though, was that we wanted to make sure that our first global launch of self-service threat modeling was successful. We wanted to get all of these bugs worked out before, when we only had 8 teams, not when we had over 100 all asking for the same thing at the same time. This also helped us build some credibility, too, because when we could prove that we were true to our word when we said we will address your concerns, we will take your feedback, and we will evaluate before we go live. And so that credibility helped build trust that we continue to ride that momentum today. After that pilot and after those changes, then it was time to roll out globally. Our approach was that we started by launching the training in our learning management system, and we opened up a voluntary adoption period for teams to apply what they've learned, ask questions, and try to test their threat modeling muscle before we made threat models a mandatory requirement for our future security reviews. I will say this plan worked better than we could have anticipated. So right away, we had teams start submitting threat models with their security reviews. It was great. The first threat model, I will never forget. The team identified 2 threats. That might not sound like a lot, but in addition to the 2 threats that they identified, they attached 2 JIRA tickets to mitigate those threats, and those tickets were closed before that security review crossed my team's desk. That was huge. That started to validate our hypothesis, again, that if teams had enough lead time, they would bake those fixes in before those features ever got to production. By the time our mandatory adoption period came, it was pretty anticlimactic. We had a few communications that, hey, threat models are now required for security reviews, but it didn't matter. The cultural change had already happened. That behavioral change had already taken hold. All right, so as of this week, we have gotten to the 1-year anniversary of when we launched that pilot in the first place. I want to take some time to talk about program impact and evolution, and then we'll switch gears and start talking about you. In the last 12 months, I did a quick deep dive a few months ago and saw that we had already had at least 200 threat models created and submitted to us. And as of a few weeks ago, I could still even see that there are 50 threat modeling tickets in the backlog, which is awesome. These are things that my team's not filing. My team's not filing for those. Teams are automatically putting that into their project plans. With those 200 or so threat models that I could find, on average, they have about 8 threats identified. Of those, about half of those threats are prioritized for addressing of some kind, whether that's mitigation, elimination, or detection and response. Probably about the other half are accepted. Now, of those that are prioritized for action of some kind, this is where I start to lose some visibility. So I would estimate that about half of those have already been addressed and half of them are in the upcoming backlog. You'll notice that I'm kind of hemming and hawing a little bit about the numbers, but here's why. I view this lack of perfect visibility as okay. The reason is that philosophically, our engineering teams are the ones who are responsible for the security of their applications. So that means that their work tracking has to meet their needs more than it needs to meet mine. At the end of the day, my teams are still reviewing features before they go out the door. They're still performing pen tests. They're still reviewing the threat models for adequacy and adding to them where need be. But at the end of the day, that's the outcome that I care about. I don't care nearly as much about my ability to have perfect visibility in JIRA. Now, if you do all of the math with 200 threat models, 8 per threat model, 4 that are prioritized for action, and about half that are already done, that works out to about 400 threats that our software engineers have identified and done something about. If you think back to what I said about when I first started New Relic and I had 3 security engineers, yes, they did threat modeling, but they also had a lot of other work on their plate. Those numbers outpace what my team could have done in that same time period. So if you're asking if self-service threat modeling is worth it, for us it absolutely was, and I bet you will be in the same boat. All right, so that's impact. Let's talk about how the program is looking a year after our pilot. So first, our engineers still seem to love the threat modeling training. We consistently hear that this is the best security training that we have put out, and that always makes us feel good. But what we also notice is that over 90% of our threat models, or of our security reviews, are coming preloaded with threat models without my team even having to ask. That's huge. In those security reviews, as we're looking at the threat models, we are finding that our teams truly are identifying the big and the obvious threats, and they're doing something about them. That's great, because if they're big and obvious to a team, They're big and obvious to a threat actor as well. We have started to see that these threat models have also helped my team accelerate their learning curve when it comes to performing those security reviews, and we have gotten those velocity gains that we anticipated. This creates that better experience. We do continuously have teams who ask for checklists, and that's always an interesting conversation. What we hear is the need to make threat modeling and all of the processes that they follow. It's not just specific to security. They want those processes to be lighter weight and easier to do. However, a critical part of threat modeling is critical thinking, and checklists often deter that. We'll be talking a little bit about what's next, but one of the things that we're going to look to do is figure out ways to satisfy the need for additional resources without short-circuiting the critical thinking benefits that threat modeling can provide. Now, here was a complete surprise to us. So we had a team come to us and they said, this threat modeling training is great, but we have teams that are very specifically front-end and we want to give them more guidance. Here, I've created a document with a bunch of other things that teams should consider. Do you mind taking a look for us? This was awesome. What this told us was that our engineers were threat modeling not just out of compliance to company policy, but they were actually interested and invested in the process and the outcome. And so we did have a cultural transformation on our hands. As with most things, programs evolve and they change over time. A few months ago, our architects also launched a new effort to evaluate all of our features for quality and reliability improvements. As part of that, we saw an opportunity to also insert threat modeling in there. So now, in addition to those product iterations that teams are threat modeling, we're also starting to develop a library of capability level threat models. We've also been able to open that up to our software engineering org. This allows them to learn from each other and get additional resources and improve the way they threat model out of a peer learning model, and we've found that to be really effective. We've done a lot of work with threat modeling, but we aren't done yet. This year, since we are now on the birthday of our pilot, we are starting to think hard about what's next. We're going to take some time on our roadmap to evaluate our company's maturity with threat modeling. We'll take a look at a lot of the threat models that have been submitted and really start to think about what additional resources can we provide to our teams. At New Relic, we largely believe in an anti-fear, anti-FUD security culture. However, our engineers do really like a good ghost story every once in a while. We're exploring this concept of having our internal pen tester share some of his exploits with the team so that they can see threats specific to New Relic. We might also open up our bug bounty findings. Again, the goal isn't to scare anybody, but it's to help instill this confidence that threat modeling is not just extra overhead in their processes. It's not just a theoretical exercise. It's something they can do to materially improve the security of their applications. Additionally, like many of you all, we are also starting to look at how can we use generative AI to safely augment the threat modeling process. Here's a little bit about what we have in mind for our exploration. First, when it comes to what are we working on, there are a lot of approaches that I've seen folks experiment with the industry. First, some folks try to pump in as much source code as they absolutely can into their generative AI solution. This one isn't as compatible with our processes because since we want teams to threat model during design, there's often not sufficient code to throw at a generative AI solution at this point. There are other folks who will convert their data flow diagrams into YAML files or markup, or even just shortcut all of that all together and go straight to mermaid diagrams and feed those in. That might work. There are also people who just take a totally different approach. They throw all that out the window and they put in a natural language executive summary of their system and they identify some of the key components. All of these are valid approaches. My team needs to experiment with some of these and figure out what produces the most useful results for us and then share those broadly with the rest of the organization. Similarly, we want to experiment with what prompts give us the most useful list of threats and controls as well. Now, I have an amazing team. They have lots of experience. They want to experiment in their free time. But free time, as you know, is not something we as security folks get a lot of. And so that's why we are going to be carving out capacity on our roadmap to intentionally do this exploration. At this point, I've spent the last 35 minutes talking about New Relic, and so I want to shift gears and I want to start talking about you. So chances are that if you're in this room, you're interested in exploring something like this at your company, and I want to give you a framework for doing just that. Step one, when you go back to work next week, the absolute first thing you need to do is figure out what your DevSecOps philosophy is. Socialize that internally with your security team, and then shout it from the rooftops and engage your software engineering org and your other engineers. This is where, once you start to hear them say that back to you, you know that your philosophy has taken hold and that you have a foundation for this. At this point, start interviewing teams. This is where you're going to learn how software development actually happens at your org, and spoiler, it is probably not how you think it does. And you're also going to learn about the requirements that your program is going to have, and you're going to figure out what are some of the points of friction that you are going to anticipate so that you can plan your communications and your rollout. After that, you can spend some time then building the program itself. You can build the training, the workflows, the templates, the support systems, and identify who your champions are who would be willing to pilot and give you critical feedback. After that, once you make any tweaks that you need to, that's when you can roll that out broadly. This is where you're going to have more of a cultural change on your hands, where you're going to need to get not only those early adopters who are hopefully hearing the success stories from the pilot teams, but you also need to figure out a way to keep encouraging folks who may still be skeptical. For us, one of the things that we did was we would start to praise teams who tried threat modeling, even if, and sometimes especially if, their threat models weren't perfect. What this does is I think there are so many software engineers out there who are afraid that security is going to tell them what to do and then yell at them for doing a bad job at it. By doing the opposite of that, that's when you'll start to build the confidence and the momentum that this is something that it's safe to try, and they'll figure out how to get better, and from there you can iterate over time. Now, when it comes to resources to build a program like this, every company is different. You're going to have different headwinds and tailwinds than we did at New Relic, but let me give you a reference point for what worked for us, and you can figure out how to scale that at your company. So first, it took us 3 quarters to build the program, and it followed basically that slide I just showed you. Second, we had 4 people in my security team, including myself. We did this on top of our normal day jobs. We did spend a little bit of money for the Articulate 360 platform. That was a training content creation system that was already in use at New Relic, and it was super intuitive for folks like us who are not instructional designers. However, if you have a budget of $0, a lot of times your learning management system will already have content creation platforms built in, and so that is optional based on what you have available. But finally, the statistic that I think you're going to like the most is that it took us no additional headcount to build the program or sustain it. All of my engineers helped build this on top of their day jobs, knowing that the results would be worth it, and they were. Hopefully, in seeing this, not only do you have the confidence to do the same, but have the confidence to know it truly doesn't take a lot if you don't have a lot, as long as you are intentional with building it out. And that concludes New Relic's case study about how we successfully rolled out threat modeling to our software engineering org. My hope is that through this, you have the confidence and the framework to know that it is possible to train software engineers to do this high-value work, that they will do a good job, and that can help drive a security culture transformation on your team. I know we have a few minutes left for Q&A. I will be here all week. I will also be hanging out at New Relic's headquarters nearby if anybody wants to stop by and talk there. I also blog very sporadically. keyword very sporadically, at jamiedicken.com, so you can see some of my threat modeling musings there. Thank you again so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Hi. Thank you for sharing your insights about the rollout of your program. So I have two questions for you.
Perfect.
The first one is, we did something similar in our development process long back with promising results. But one of the challenges is when we are dealing with legacy applications or third-party products. So these applications have been there for 20, 30 years with no development team backing them. So when you do a threat model, sometimes it's not easy to mitigate them. You do compensating controls or transfer the risk. So any thoughts on how you protect legacy applications when it doesn't have a development team behind it?
Yeah, so we face this quite a bit, and I see it in the industry as well. And so one of the things that I like to remind people is that mitigation is not the only option to address a threat. You can also decide if mitigation is too impractical, how do you detect that it's happening and build in responses as well? So that's something that we train our teams to not just focus on fixing, but figuring out what else you could do. Also, that might be the time where we also encourage teams to reach out to the security team and say, hey, I really don't know what to do about this. And then that's when we can provide that tier 2 level support and figure out if there are compensating controls or there are other tools we have in our arsenal.
Yeah, it sounds like we are doing similar things, so that's good to hear. And the second question I have is, how do you validate the quality of a threat model? Because like we have tried with some automated tools and they use a library, so it comes up with a lot of threats. But then in this case, I think having a false positive is better than having a false negative. So looking at accuracy versus recall, what are you more leaning towards in terms of looking at the validity and accuracy of a threat model?
Yeah, so early on, our focus was really just in getting teams to try in the first place, because if they never tried, they were never going to get better. What we do now during the course of our security reviews is we will take a look at those threat models, and we do a few things. One, we do assess effort to see, to make sure that teams were actually trying and not just, oh, you write something down, you throw it over the wall, and you say you check the box. This is where we also view our responsibility as being additional trainers. So say we get a threat model and there's something that is big and obvious to us that's missing. That's where the security review process is very collaborative with our engineers. It's not just throw it over the wall and we tell you if it's good or not. And so we will do some coaching during the course of those security reviews. But then also that's what some of our roadmap time will be based on, is going through and taking a second look at all of those and identifying, for example, when I teach classes for Showstock and Associates, repudiation is by far the #1 threat that everybody is confused about. And so that's one of those where we'll start to focus on educating people what repudiation looks like and how to go about mitigating it. So it's a training opportunity, and then when we do see those big gaps, it's a combination of coaching, and then we will add that to the threat model and discuss with the team how to address.
So if I understand you correctly, you're taking a more qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach.
At this point, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Hey, Jamie, thanks for putting this on.
Absolutely.
Couple questions. You suggested that the change design doc is the optimal place to begin the threat modeling. Did you start from were there baseline threat models in place before the change design doc? So when you built this process, did you already have a set of threat models for the apps as they were originally built?
It depended. It wasn't consistent. So if my team had previously reviewed that feature and we had made a threat model, then yes. If it was something that, for whatever reason, hadn't gone through a security review or it was a brand new feature, then no, we didn't. There were also times, like I said, where we had to make trade-offs to say, hey, if we have too much of a backlog, these things will get threat models and these things we'll have to throw in a backlog and come back to later. And so for us, it was more like the art of the start, if you will. And starting to build up that library. Where we had them, we could use them and we could share them, but it wasn't consistent at that point.
Cool. Second question, given that engineers are typically incentivized by knocking out their story points, how'd you incentivize them?
Yeah, so I believe that what a lot of our teams do is they will create a story with story points for that change design document in the first place, so they can keep checking that box if that helps them. Because we hooked into that change design document and that was an engineering mandated practice and not a security mandated practice, that also helped because it wasn't just another team throwing work onto them. That was their own leadership driving that accountability.
Nice. Thank you.
Of course.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was awesome. I have a question. You presented some numbers in terms of threats that you have identified during the implementation. And are you presenting these, or how are you presenting these numbers as business outcomes? Are you relating this?
Yeah, so we focus on a few things. So one, at the end of the day, what our leadership cares about is deploying resilient and secure applications. Mm-hmm. And so we previously had times where we would have to either say, hey, like we haven't had a chance to get this, and that would actually impact launch plans. But now what we're able to do is we present, hey, we enabled the successful on-time delivery of these features. We have taken a look, and not only do you have a clean pen test, but that's the outcome that you care about so that you don't have delays to your launches. But the reason why you probably have a clean pen test is because you have taken care of and addressed those security threats during that design time. And so we really focus on discussing the outcomes and what the business cares about. And we allow the threat modeling to be the behind-the-scenes enabler that made that outcome possible.
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned when you kind of took that break from before making the decision on the rollout and stuff, you're collecting data. Would you mind sharing like what kind of data you were collecting?
Yeah, of course. So there were a few things. We did put a survey at the end of our training just to get like a numeric net promoter score, if you will. We got an average of, I think it was like 4.5 something stars out of 5, so we felt really good about that. We also took a look at the threat models because one of the security concerns was that, teams are just gonna kind of half do it. And so we were able to be like, no, even during our pilot, it was about 8 to 12 threats each for those teams. And so we were able to show that, no, teams aren't just like checking the box and throwing it over the wall. And then we would do some qualitative evaluation too to say, this was a solid first effort for it being the first threat model that a team has generated. And so being able to assemble all of those together, coupled with the fact that we could see that teams were already starting to address threats, and we had a couple JIRA tickets that we could point to at the time, that was what we needed to get that confidence level. And then we also issued qualitative surveys as well, and that's how we found out about needing to get additional resources and incorporating into that change design document.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think that is time, so thank you again, everybody. It means the world to me that you came bright and early to see this, and happy to continue the conversation.